This was the life of a truck driver in the USA, 1972. Between 1992 and 1995, truck driving killed more workers than any other occupation in the United States, accounting for 12% of all worker deaths in the country across those 4 years. Nearly 3,000 truck drivers lost their lives on the job in that single 3-year window, and another 151,000 were seriously injured, more non-fatal injuries than any other occupation in the country. Those are the numbers from the 90s, when safety regulations had already improved considerably from what existed in 1972. Go back 20 years, to the era before mandatory electronic logging devices, before computerized dispatch, before satellite tracking, before the federal hours of service rules had the enforcement infrastructure to mean anything on a dark stretch of Interstate 70 at 2 in the morning. And the picture is darker still. In 1972, a long-haul truck driver in the United States operated in a regulatory environment that placed enormous pressure on him to drive more hours than his body could safely sustain, on roads that were still being built and improved, in vehicles whose safety systems were a fraction of what modern trucks carry, with no reliable way to communicate an emergency to anyone outside the cab except by stopping the truck and finding a telephone. He was the most essential invisible worker in the American economy, hauling the goods that every household, every factory, and every store in the country depended on. And he did it in conditions that the people buying those goods never thought about, and the government only loosely regulated. What was that life actually like? The interstate highway system that President Eisenhower had signed into law in 1956 was, by 1972, still under active construction in many parts of the country. The network that existed was already transforming American commerce and making long-haul trucking the dominant mode of freight transportation in the United States. A load that had once moved primarily by rail could now move door-to-door by truck, faster and with more flexibility than the railroad schedule allowed. The growth of the trucking industry in the 2 decades following the Interstate Highway Act was staggering. By the early 1970s, trucks were hauling approximately 70% of consumer and industrial goods in the United States, logging hundreds of billions of miles annually. Behind every one of those miles was a driver, sitting in the cab of a tractor-trailer combination that typically weighed 80,000 pounds, fully loaded, covering ground at 60 or 65 miles per hour, managing a vehicle the length of a standard city bus and a half through weather, traffic, construction zones, mountain grades, and the particular challenge of driving through the night when the body's natural rhythms were pushing hard toward sleep. The federal hours of service regulations that existed in 1972 allowed a driver to be on duty for up to 15 hours and behind the wheel for up to 10 of those hours before a mandatory rest period. Those rules existed on paper. Whether they were followed in practice depended heavily on the driver, the dispatcher, the company, and the degree to which the logbook, the paper record every driver was required to maintain, reflected what had actually happened rather than what the regulations required. Before we continue, comment below if you have ever worked in a dangerous job. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming content. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. The Teamsters Union was, in 1972, the largest labor union in the United States, representing more than 2 million workers. The National Master Freight Agreement that Jimmy Hoffa had negotiated in 1964, covering more than 450,000 over-the-road truck drivers, had standardized wages and benefits across the industry in a way that made unionized trucking one of the better compensated blue-collar occupations in the country. A Teamster driver hauling freight in 1972 could earn wages that put his family solidly in the middle class, with health benefits and a pension that most non-union workers in comparable physical occupations could not match. Hoffa himself had disappeared from a restaurant parking lot in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, on July 30th, 1975, amid ongoing battles over the Teamsters presidency and his alleged connections to organized crime, a disappearance that has never been resolved. But in 1972, 3 years before that, the union was still at the peak of its influence in the trucking industry, and the wages it had secured were real. The pressure that accompanied those wages was also real. A driver who was paid by the mile had a direct financial incentive to cover more miles per day than the hours of service regulations technically allowed. A driver on a load with a delivery deadline faced pressure from the dispatcher, from the shipper, and from the economic logic of the pay structure to arrive on time regardless of what the regulations said about mandatory rest. The interior of a long-haul tractor cab in 1972 was a working environment of considerable discomfort by any standard applied from the outside. The sleeper berth, the compartment behind the driver's seat, where a driver was expected to rest during mandatory off-duty periods, was typically a bunk approximately 2 feet wide by 6 feet long, mounted above or behind the main cab, accessible through a curtain that separated it from the driver's area. In warm weather, the cab heated rapidly when the engine was off. In cold weather, idling the engine for heat consumed fuel the company was paying for and generated complaints. The driver who pulled into a truck stop at 3 in the morning for his mandatory rest period crawled into the sleeper in a parking lot full of other idling trucks and attempted to get 8 hours of restorative sleep before pulling out again at 11, was performing a biological task that the physical environment did not particularly support. The noise, the vibration of surrounding trucks, the light from the truck stop, the temperature, all of it worked against the quality of rest that the regulations assumed was happening during the off-duty period. Driver fatigue was a factor in a significant proportion of serious truck accidents in 1972, as it remains today. A third of fatal highway incidents involving truck drivers occurred between midnight and 8 in the morning, when the physiological pressure toward sleep was greatest. The CB radio transformed the social world of long-haul trucking in 1972 in ways that went well beyond the practical information it transmitted. The Citizens Band radio, which operated on frequencies the FCC had opened to unlicensed public use, had been adopted by truck drivers as a communication tool years before the general public discovered it in the mid-1970s CB craze. By 1972, a driver running the interstate system without a CB was an exception rather than a rule. The radio gave drivers a way to communicate with each other across the miles, warning of police presence ahead, reporting scale stations that were open and weighing trucks, alerting to accidents and road hazards, sharing information about road conditions in bad weather, and simply talking through the long hours of a night run when the alternative was silence and the particular mental effort of staying alert on a dark highway at 2 in the morning. The CB created a community among people whose work was otherwise defined by isolation, men who spent weeks away from home, eating at truck stops, sleeping in parking lots, covering thousands of miles without seeing anyone they knew. Channel 19 became the de facto channel for highway communication, and the coded language that developed: Smokies for police, Bears for troopers, City Kitties for municipal police. The hammer down for running fast was a dialect that marked membership in a working community that existed largely outside of public visibility. The physical demands of driving a loaded tractor-trailer in 1972 went well beyond the steering wheel hours that the hours of service regulations counted and attempted to limit. Before and after every run, the driver was responsible for inspecting the vehicle, checking the tires, the lights, the brakes, the coupling between the tractor and the trailer, the condition of the load, and the security of its tie-downs. Loading and unloading freight at the dock, when the driver was expected to participate rather than simply wait, was physical work that could run to hours of lifting, moving, and stacking goods that ranged from consumer products to industrial equipment. In winter, chains had to be mounted on the drive axles when road conditions required it, a task performed on the shoulder of a highway or in a chain-up area, in freezing temperatures, often at night, with traffic passing at speed. The mechanical unreliability of trucks in 1972 meant that drivers spent more time than their modern counterparts dealing with breakdowns, changing tires, troubleshooting engines, managing situations that had no resolution available without a phone call to a dispatcher who might or might not be able to send help quickly to a remote location. The driver who broke down on a mountain pass in Wyoming in January of 1972 was dealing with conditions that had no technological solution and no communication option beyond the CB radio and whatever passing trucks chose to stop and help. The truck stop was the institutional center of the long-haul driver's social world in 1972. The place where the practical necessities of fuel, food, and a shower intersected with the community that the CB radio had suggested, but the geography of the road kept dispersed. The major truck stops along the interstate routes, the Flying J locations, the pilot stops, the independent operations that had grown up at highway interchanges to serve the growing freight traffic, were operational 24 hours a day, offering the kind of round-the-clock availability that matched the driver's schedule. The food was consistent and caloric. The meals a man ate who needed to get back in the cab within the hour and cover 300 more miles before his next mandatory rest. The counter where drivers sat was a place where men who had been running the same routes for years recognized each other without necessarily knowing names, where the shared language of the road created instant common ground, and where information about conditions ahead moved faster than any official broadcast could manage. The truck stop mechanic, available at hours when conventional repair shops were closed, was a figure of considerable importance to a driver whose livelihood depended on keeping moving. The deregulation of the trucking industry that Congress enacted in the Motor Carrier Act of 1980 would fundamentally change the economics of long-haul trucking, reducing rates, reducing union coverage, and increasing competitive pressure in ways that had lasting consequences for driver wages, working conditions, and the structure of the industry. In 1972, that future was still 8 years away, and the Teamster driver who pulled his loaded rig out of a Chicago terminal and pointed it toward Los Angeles was operating within a regulated industry that, whatever its other failings, had used collective bargaining to establish a floor of wages and benefits below which unionized operators could not go. He was paid decently for extremely hard and dangerous work. He was away from his family for weeks at a time and home for days at a time, in a rhythm that domestic life could accommodate only by organizing itself around his absence. He covered miles that added up to hundreds of thousands over a career. Miles driven in weather that ranged from fog so thick the road disappeared to ice storms that turned the interstate into a skating rink, to heat so intense that tires failed and asphalt became soft, in a vehicle that he knew better than any mechanic who worked on it, in a country that needed everything he was carrying and rarely thought about the man who was doing the carrying. The long-term health consequences of a career in long-haul trucking accumulated in ways that were not yet formally studied in 1972, but would be extensively documented in the decades that followed. More than 80% of long-haul truck drivers eventually reported at least one serious health condition, including obesity driven by the combination of sedentary hours and truck stop food, hypertension from the sustained stress of highway driving, and irregular schedules, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. The irregular sleep patterns that the job imposed, disrupted by the hours of service rotation, by the noise and conditions of the sleeper berth, by the physiological mismatch between a body adapted to daytime waking and a schedule that required nighttime driving, produced chronic sleep disruption that accumulated across careers into measurable health consequences. The social cost was also documented. Family disruption, high divorce rates, and the particular difficulty of maintaining relationships with children who spent their formative years with a father who was present for days and absent for weeks, cycling in and out of the household on a schedule that the freight calendar determined. These were not consequences that the trucking industry acknowledged or accounted for in 1972. They were simply the conditions of the work accepted as fixed features of a job that paid well enough and needed doing badly enough that men kept taking it. The driver who climbed into his cab in 1972 and pulled out onto the interstate was participating in the movement of an economy. The corn from Iowa to the flour mill in Kansas City, the steel from the Pittsburgh mill to the auto plant in Detroit, the finished cars from Detroit to the dealerships in Phoenix and Portland, all of it moved on trucks driven by men running hours of service schedules that existed in tension with biology, through weather and terrain that existed in tension with physics, in vehicles that were more reliable than what had come before and less reliable than what would come after. The country ate because these men drove. The stores stayed stocked because these men drove. The factories kept running because these men drove. That dependency was total and largely invisible to the people it served, which is the nature of essential infrastructure everywhere. It becomes noticeable only when it stops working. The long-haul truck driver of 1972 was the essential invisible man of the American economy, doing work that the country could not function without, in conditions that the country preferred not to think about, for wages that were decent while the union held and would become less so when it didn't. The relationship between the truck driver and his vehicle in 1972 was one of the defining features of the occupation. A practical, technical intimacy that developed necessarily when a man spent 10 or 12 hours a day in a machine that weighed 80,000 pounds and that he was solely responsible for operating safely. The tractor of 1972 was a substantially less sophisticated machine than what modern drivers operate. There was no electronic stability control, no collision avoidance system, no automatic emergency braking. The brakes were air brakes, and managing them on a mountain descent, controlling the air pressure, avoiding brake fade from overheating on a long grade, feeling through the pedal what the brakes were doing to a fully loaded trailer that was pushing 70,000 pounds downhill into the back of the tractor, was a skill that took years to develop and that had no substitute. A driver who overcooked his brakes on a mountain grade in Colorado or on the Donner Pass descent into California in 1972 was managing a situation that the vehicle's systems could not help him recover from. He managed it with experience, with the specific physical sense for what the truck was doing that only develops through years of driving, and with the understanding that the margin between a controlled descent and a runaway was measured in decisions made seconds apart. The drivers who made those runs successfully year after year, and arrived at the bottom of the grade with their load intact and their trailer where it was supposed to be, knew something about that margin that they could not easily explain to anyone who had not made the same run in the same conditions. The 1972 truck driver's working life was also shaped by the specific geography of the American highway network in ways that have since changed almost beyond recognition. The interstate system was not yet complete, and significant portions of long-haul runs still involved two-lane federal and state highways passing through the centers of small towns, stopping at traffic lights, navigating intersections designed for passenger cars, managing the particular challenge of a long trailer through a town center that its planners had never imagined would see vehicles of this size. The truck stop culture that had grown up around the highway network was not yet the large, commodified, chain-operated facilities of the modern era. Many of the truck stops of 1972 were independent operations, family businesses that had grown up at highway interchanges to serve the freight traffic moving through, where the owner might be behind the counter, and where the food and the service reflected the specific character of the region rather than a national brand standard. This gave the truck stop network a texture and variety that the modern standardized rest areas and chain facilities have largely replaced, and it meant that the driver who ran a regular route developed over years a specific map of the places along his route where the coffee was reliable, where the mechanic was competent, where the lot had enough room to maneuver a loaded rig, and where the dispatcher at the carrier's terminal down the road would have his next load ready when he pulled in. That specific local knowledge was a form of professional capital that accumulated across a career and made an experienced driver on a familiar route a fundamentally different operator from a new driver learning the roads.